You know, Melissa, I actually had a good night's sleep last night with no horrible dreams, like from episode 2, for the first time in ages. I feel super refreshed today.
That's really nice. That's really nice. I'm a bit jealous actually because I did not sleep well last night. I didn't actually sleep much at all. I was playing poker pretty late at my local card room where I normally play. And it was one of those tables where there was a player at the table who was playing any two cards, more or less, that came into his hands. And he was donating a lot of money to the table and attracting a crowd of grinders who didn't want to leave because he was being so generous. And when I actually finally got up to leave the table, one of my friends who's a regular there actually said to me, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you leaving? This game's so good. Like, this guy is just like, he doesn't care. Like, he's just this whale, blah, blah, blah. And I ended up leaving, but I kind of really thought twice about it. I hesitated, but it was pretty late and I was pretty tired, and I ended up leaving. But I wanted to talk today with you, Pete, about some of like the ethical questions around being a poker player. Specifically, the situation where I'm sure a lot of people who are listening have been in, where you are at a table and someone is drunk or under the influence of something and spreading the wealth, if you will, or maybe they're totally sober, but they're just like a terrible player or clearly just not even capable of understanding what's going on and just losing money right and left. Some of the questions that I think are interesting, that this does raise some interesting questions that I think are would be good to talk about today. So that was kind of my idea. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting subject because poker is a strange game in that in poker you compete with people that are entirely different to you in level for resources, and you don't really do that in any other sport or hobby or even profession. Like, usually you're competing against people who are on somewhat of a competitive equal playing field. If you look at like tennis and you look at a tennis tournament, probably there aren't too many matches that are as lopsided as that, like some drunk maniac just spewing buy-in after buy-in and a bunch of regs gathered round the table like vultures scavenging on the sort of deteriorating corpse of this player. So obviously I'm framing this in a way that's meant to make you feel eternally guilty about you staying up late to take this person's money. But on a serious note, well, where do we draw the line? Like, what if this was business or something like that? Like, what if you were a business owner and someone came to you and was like, can I give you this pub that I own? Can I just give you this pub? Because like it's stressing me out too much and I'm going through a bit of a rough time and I can't really be bothered dealing with it. So now you just have it. It's yours. It's yours. You just take it. This actually comes from an episode of Peep Show, one of my favorite UK sitcoms that you should definitely check out, where an insane lady called Meryl gives Mark, the main character, her pub because she's insane and needs to be committed to some kind of mental health hospital or whatever. So that's too far, clearly, right? To like accept that pub. Would you agree? That's too far?
Yeah, I think so. I think I would definitely agree with that. Yeah.
So then what if we say that you're like a car salesman and someone comes up and insists on paying 1.5 times the listed price for a car because they like it that much? How do you feel about that case?
I think that there's a fine line that has to be examined in any kind of situation where you have a transaction between two people and one of the people is not of sound mind.
Mm-hmm.
So not of sound mind can mean a couple of different things. You could be someone who's seriously mentally ill. So in that case, I would say that no, that contract to buy that car is not valid. I don't think that that would be something that could stand up in a legal setting. That wouldn't be a real contract. And I think that if the person was truly mentally ill. Now, if a person has maybe had a few drinks and says, I've had my eye on this car for years and there it is, and I'm not going to let it get away. And you know what? Screw it. I'm going to pay 3 times above the sticker price. I think that's fine. And I think that humans have agency to be able to enter into contracts and transactions that may be absolutely in their worst interest. But I think that's part of freedom of contract, which is something that I'm a big proponent of. And I think when it comes to something like poker and the people who sit down to a poker game, that for the most part, and I would say like maybe something like 80% of the time, maybe even higher than that, I think it's totally fair by sitting down at a poker table, entering into a game, you're agreeing to the rules of the game, you're agreeing to the risk that you're entering into, you're agreeing to the fact that there may be better players than you. You're also agreeing to drink. No one's forcing alcohol down your throat. No one's injecting you with stimulants or something. All of that is in your own control. And so if because of those factors that are in your control, you play in a way that is like awful and you lose money and you wake up the next morning and you feel terrible, that's on you. Now, I think the difference is if you're having a psychotic episode and you wander away from a group home and you wander into a casino and you say, give me, you take out a bunch of cash and you just take chips. And that's, I think, a little bit different. And I think that would be crossing the line where someone's not of sound mind. But I don't think being intoxicated is enough to say you're not of sound mind. Therefore, this is not ethical.
Okay. So maybe what we're saying here is that it's more important to allow individuals freedom of transaction and for the free market to be upheld between every individual that is a part of that system than it is to protect people against any kind of consequences of foolishly entering into transactions that are going to harm them and harm their prospects. Maybe what you're saying is even stronger than that we shouldn't at all do the latter. With poker players, I totally agree that because there's an upfront contract that you could lose and they go into the game knowing that it's a game of chance in the short term to a large extent and they could win or they could lose, and they sort of consent to that idea that they're embracing the losses, just as they're going to not hand back the chips that they win after a winning session. The losses are theirs and they have to own them. And I think that many parts of a free economy have to function in that way, and poker is no different. I guess where we could maybe go with this, we could go a couple of ways with it. One potential area we could go to is, where is the line with bum hunting? So if we take bum hunting to mean the practice of intentionally playing in games that have very weak poker players in them, and like trying to, maybe you could take that a step further and say that bum hunting could even be sitting on the left of such a player, so you have like optimal position on them, moving table when they move table, leaving the table as soon as they leave the table, waiting around the lobby for them in the casino, like literally sitting at the bar having an iced tea, waiting for them to drink 2 more shots and then go to a different poker table and then following them there. Is all of that just part of the transaction of being a reg against a field? Is that just optimizing your edge against the field and being a good reg? Or is there a point where that kind of behavior becomes predatory and goes too far? And if so, what is that point?
That's interesting. I think that I kind of want to separate 2 different threads from that question. The first question is, what is optimal in terms of, from like a theoretical optimal way of playing that gives you the most, the highest EV, the best chances of winning money, et cetera, the most profitable, I guess you could say. Clearly, that would be most profitable. If that's something that is a way of behaving and treating other people that, is obviously I think there's some nuance to that, but for the most part, in your hypothetical, I would say that, yes, that is a profitable way to play. However, what is profitable and what you're okay with doing as a human being to another human being is another question. There are a lot of, I think, ways to do business that are legal. You're not going to get arrested or you're not going to get convicted or accused of fraud or anything, but you can still enter in these transactions. I think of things like, one of the things in the state where I live is, it's one of the great ironies is that the state lottery, which is completely, run by the government, advertises using cartoon characters. Okay, well, who's that supposed to appeal to? Adults certainly will watch it, but it's also supposed to appeal to kids. And this is something that's funded by taxpayers. And the money from this lottery obviously goes back to the state. I think there is some big problems with advertising lotteries with bright colors and ways that are going to attract young children into playing a game, buying a lotto ticket and having a absolutely zero chance of winning. Is there anything illegal about it? No, but I think it's distasteful and awful. And I also think it's bad when it's coming from, the government that I pay taxes to. But back to your hypothetical, I think that no, there is nothing wrong. I think if you're a person that can sleep at night after following someone into a bar and waiting for them to finish their shots and following them to the next table, I think that you're entitled to do that. I don't think there's anything, quote unquote, ethically wrong with that, because the person who is on the other side of that is playing a game where that could potentially happen. And there's nothing against the rules that makes that wrong. Now, if that person takes 2 shots and then says, oh, okay, I don't want to play anymore, I'm going to go up to my room. Well, that's their choice too. And you've wasted hours, with this person. I think that's kind of my immediate take on that, on your question.
Interesting. That's kind of the opposite to my immediate take. So maybe for the first time we get to have a proper fight on Poker Distilled, because we usually agree on too much. You're like, good, bring it on. I'm sick of agreeing with you, Pete. Yeah, I feel like you're conflating morality and legality a little bit too much there, both in terms of, okay, maybe not in terms of outside of poker, because you did say that you thought what the state was doing was really immoral, even though it wasn't illegal, so you've not conflated it there at all. But I think from within poker, there's something really immoral about that to me, even though it's within the rules of the game. So I think there are lots of things that are technically within the rules of the game that are still immoral, and I would argue that by saying that I think the scope of the rules of the game actually stop at the table. I think the rules of poker do not in any way preside over whether it's okay to be like it's like kind of creepy and stalky to me, like this like predatory following of a fish into a bar, waiting for them to consume a certain amount of alcohol and then following them back to the casino. Like, I know there's nothing illegal about that, but that strikes me as kind of abhorrent. And I think the rules of poker, for me, stop presiding over the game the minute you're not just the minute you're up from the table. They don't preside over everything at the table. The rules of poker don't stipulate whether it's like okay morally or legally for me to like throw my coffee in your face or something like that. So they don't even preside over everything at the table, and I certainly don't think they preside over whether it's okay to follow somebody about and then choose to play only when that person is playing, monitoring the amount of alcohol they consume. I kind of picked that situation because, to me, interestingly, that was something that I thought we would both agree was definitely too far. So this is interesting that we've kind of already reached a stalemate on that. So if I'm right that the rules of poker itself are irrelevant and don't have sufficient dominion over that sort of thing, like the following of the person around the other areas of the casino and the waiting for them to play and going from table to table wherever they go, if that's external to the rules of the game, it must be internal to some objective set of standards or rules. Would you agree with that? That there must be some objective set of moral principles that preside over that? So then, if poker isn't fulfilling that role, maybe we just go to, I don't know what your position is on whether you think there are, I would guess that you think that there are objective norms in ethics. I would guess that you do, from what I know about
absolutely.
you. Yep.
Absolutely.
So if we can, and that's a contentious topic, right? A lot of people are looking at us right now and saying, or are listening to this and saying, no, it's moral relativism all the way. There are no objective principles. God is dead and all of this sort of thing. And that aside, though, if there have to be a moral set of guidelines that preside over that situation, and if I'm right that they shouldn't actually come from the rules of poker or even the house rules or even the casino rules in that case, then they come from like a general overarching human moral code. And to me, the behavior of like, I'm going to move away from the stalking someone in a bar part, because I think that's like kind of, I threw that into kind of, it's overkill and it needn't actually be in there. So let's say that we're following them to the blackjack table, keeping an eye on them while they're there, sitting with our friends at the table eating dinner, watching them, saying like, oh, you going to come with us to this nightclub we're going to go to? No, I'm going to keeping an eye on this whale in case they go back to the table. That to me is too far, and I'm not okay with it. And I think the reason I'm not okay with it is that it has a real predatory aspect to it, where you're using someone else's weaknesses and you're benefiting from those weaknesses. And I think within a game or within a sport, like if it's, say, boxing and someone extends their jab too far and leaves themselves vulnerable to an uppercut and you exploit that, that's totally fine. You're exploiting them within the game. But if somebody has a weakness in life and you go out and exploit them for their weakness for your own game that you've observed, and then you take from them or you profit from them because of that, that to me is a bit verging on like parasitic and psychopathic kind of personality traits. So I think, to me, the reason I'm deeply uncomfortable with another reg doing that is that it seems to me as if they are possibly a psychopath, or they possibly have traits of that, and they're willing to use another's weakness or misfortune in order to gain it. Now, they'll justify it as it's within their realm of poker and it's all part of the grind and it's EV man and all of this sort of thing, but I think there has to be a limit somewhere. So I'll let you push back on any of that first before we move on.
I think the issue of whether something is moral or correct is, I'm less interested in that part of the question as whether something is like economically useful. So for instance, like you could maybe talk to somebody else and they could say, I agree with you, Pete, that's psychotic behavior, it's predatory. You say, okay, well, what point does it become predatory? Does it become predatory, meaning the minute they leave the poker table and go to another table, following them over there is predatory? When they would say no, and maybe you would say yes. And then, so that disagreement is just, it's like so subjective that for the purposes of this conversation, it's less interesting to me.
But let me add one thing, which is just really quick, that there's probably a gradient of predatoriness that's acceptable or not acceptable. So for example, if I notice that you are online on Discord and I'm considering whether I should message you and ask you to send me a file, and I notice that you were online 2 minutes ago, and I say, aha, she's likely to respond because she was online 2 minutes ago, that would score something on like the stalking predatory scale, but it would be like really, really low. It'd be like nothing, and I think all people would agree that that's okay. And then at the other end, when you're in the bar writing on a notepad how many units of alcohol the person has consumed, that's like completely psychopathic and like very worrying behavior. So there's clearly the spectrum, and at some point we have to draw a line, but that's something we have to do everywhere. But yeah, I take your point. You're approaching it more from a kind of, given that this is so profitable, and given that the aim of the poker player is to generate as much EV as possible generally, where do we sort of like draw some exceptions here, and how do we approach that? I think it's a minefield. So.
And I'm just really hesitant to tell people how to behave. Now, I say that with a big kind of caveat, in the sense of like, there are things that are clearly illegal. I think generally like any behavior that relies on or is based on the other person not consenting to that behavior is generally wrong. I think that, obviously I'm not talking about things that are just like, clearly criminal. But what I'm less willing to do is to say to someone, the way you're behaving is wrong, and I know it's best, not only for you, but for the other person involved. And so therefore, I'm going to make a moral judgment as a kind of neutral third party. Now, if you're in a court of law and you have a judge in front of you, that's totally different. But if you're in, in a casino in society, I think that there are hard questions that come up that I really personally am not always comfortable answering, because I don't know a lot of times what's best. And that's not a cop-out, but I think that's generally like, I have a kind of natural libertarian instinct. I don't like centralized power, and I don't like the idea of legislating, for the most part, legislating morality. But stepping away from that, I think as an economic matter, I am very much in favor of allowing a free market to work on its own, because I think that, and this is obviously not my invention. This is something that, your fellow countryman, Adam Smith, came up with a long time ago, which is that the free market, the invisible hand of the free market, right? Like it puts things where they need to be. So let's take your example of the person who goes into the casino, drinks a lot, loses a bunch of money. Maybe they get bum hunted by a couple of regs, or just maybe one reg. And they wake up the next morning and they say, that's, God, what an awful experience. Well, even though the ethics of that may have been questionable from the point of view of the reg, by allowing that situation to happen unimpeded by any kind of government force, both parties are going to be better off. And I think that the key to any transaction is you want both parties to be better off at the end of it. And so maybe the person who wakes up in their hotel room and says, God, I got so drunk, that was so silly, decides the next day that they're going to go and seek help for alcoholism. Or maybe they decide that they're actually going to learn how to play poker, and they go and they start, getting better at it. Maybe it drives them to take themselves more seriously and have a little bit more respect for themselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now, had there been a rule that said no bum hunting, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but had there been some kind of way of restricting that was outside of those two people, then they would not necessarily have been able to reach those endpoints. And so I think that a lot of times what the key to any kind of a free market is to increase the velocity of voluntary transactions. Like you just want people to voluntarily enter into as many transactions as possible. And I think so when you give me that example, I zoom out and I say, I think this is good as a general matter. It's not maybe it's not ethically good. That's a much different question, but I do think that as a matter of should there be rules against it? Should there be something that makes it wrong? I would say no.
Okay, so I think I'm more of a rule-based utilitarian than you are, in a sense I kind of do strive to try to maximize the best consequences overall, and I try to do that. I want to try to do that. I feel driven to try to do that with some form of order or structure or set of moral norms, ethical principles that kind of thing. I agree that when those are too strong and too strongly enforced by government or any legislative body, even like a casino or card room or something like that, you do start to impede upon the free market, the free will of individuals. And I do really like the libertarian argument that in the long run, perhaps it is good that the natural hierarchy takes its toll and that that person learns their place in the hierarchy, learns that they're a losing player, stops playing poker, stops gambling, seeks help for drinking, tries to improve themselves. Oftentimes that doesn't happen. And then you have the whole other argument of, well, they're going to keep losing money anyway, so it may as well be me who's the beneficiary. There's that whole argument as well. But to take this back to the main point here, I think where we disagree is probably the level of social intervention that's required in this kind of situation. I definitely agree that having really strong rules about if a player of X minus 40 skill level departs the table, you cannot join that table for 51 minutes. Like, that's absurd if we start going down that road. But I think that parasitic, psychopathic people who prey upon those that are weak in some area need to be quelled, and their presence needs to be quelled somewhat in society. I think they need to be kept under lock and key to some extent, and it needs to be shown to them that there are repercussions for that kind of behavior, regardless of whether that kind of behavior is illegal. We get this a lot in society. It's in part, in my opinion, society's role to seek repercussions against people, not in the form of full-blown vigilantism where the law could equally do it. I don't think people should be getting involved there, not at all. But at the casino, I think if there's a group of regs playing poker and one of them is going to a bar and, like, just to use the extreme example, maybe just within the casino is taking notes on what the player's drunk and is like following them and is like actively taking like extremely worrying steps like that to sort of stalk the individual, then that to me is something that society should do something about ethically, morally, because if they don't, then this kind of behavior and this kind of individual starts to thrive and prosper more than is healthy for the collective whole. And I think that becomes a bit of an issue. So I think where I come down on bum hunting and playing in these soft games and following weaker players about is that at the point where it starts to reward certain pathologies that seek to prey on people weaker than you in a hierarchy and out with the rules of a game structure within that hierarchy, that's the point where the subculture or society has a moral obligation to intervene in some way. And maybe they shouldn't forcefully restrain the person, stop them following the weaker player about. That would be too far. But maybe what they have to do morally is say something like, the way you're behaving here is not good for society. They'd say, that's not cool, man. Yo, bro, that's not cool. What bro, that's not cool really means in that context is, if lots of people behaved like this in society, and if we rewarded these personality traits, then we would be in big trouble, and therefore we have some duty to intervene as a collective of what healthy societal traits are. I think that's where I would come down on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think we're too far off on that. I think that I agree that people who engage in kind of that psychopathic predatory behavior, if they are not quelled, if society itself does not somehow quell that behavior, that it becomes worse. And I would agree with that. I just think that I think that you and I can both agree that it's wrong to, like you said, take it off the table, bum hunt someone by following them around. It's creepy, it's psychotic. I don't actually know anyone that's done that,
No.
But I'm much newer to poker than you are. But I think it would also be difficult to be able to like get on that person's exact same table. Like, I mean, I guess you could do it, but it would just be, I don't know, it'd be difficult. Plus you'd have to guarantee that, every time you got it in good against them, that, the variance wouldn't hit you the wrong way. And I think that you would be, I mean, a lot of times whales play in ways that are actually very difficult to play against, in the sense that they are jamming in weird spots. This happened to me last weekend where people are jamming just to gamble, right? And you're in a situation where your variance is going to potentially suffer and be really extreme just by playing with them. But I don't know enough about, like, quote unquote bum hunting. I don't have enough personal experience with it to know like how to do that or how you would go about doing that successfully. But I do think it's a really interesting ethical question. And I think that your points are certainly well taken. I guess I just don't know if I would draw the line as sharply as you would in terms of saying anything off the table is outside of the game and therefore becomes predatory and wrong, I guess you could say. I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would go that far either. I just think I'm using some really extreme cases here, like someone following someone about an entire casino and stuff like that, like
But
deliberately.
that's fine. I mean, as an exercise, that's a really good discussion, I think.
It's definitely a thought experiment because, for example, I don't think that society has a duty to step in at the level where I select one online table that has a fish at it compared to another one that doesn't. I think that's 100% fine. I don't think there's really anything predatory about that at all, or maybe if there is, it's at such the low end of the spectrum that the gains, like the sort of EV increase that I'm getting there from playing a sport, a consensual sport, is far more important to my own ability to do that well. And if we say that I can't do that, well, now we're saying that we actually have to like sacrifice pieces of our own livelihood within our own profession in order to compensate for people who are actually doing it as a vice. And that feels really wrong as well. That feels way too far another direction. Imagine I had to leave a good table because a player sat down that was really bad. And I morally had to get up and leave because I couldn't take their money. And then I had to like miss out on the EV that some slightly less weaker players were offering at that table. So that's too far. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I think where I would draw the line, just to sort of give the audience an answer on that, like my answer on that, it would probably be somewhere between following somebody physically to another table, like moving seat to sit at their left. I think that these things are I struggle with them. I'm not sure if they're too far or not. I definitely don't think making an initial judgment about which table to sit at or which site to play on online or which pool to play in is a problem. I think when an individual is being like their route through life is being directly tracked by me, that's where it triggers more of that. That's not okay. That's predatory. Society needs to curb this kind of behavior in general, not just in poker, but because that sort of human trait can get out of control, as you said. And if we don't do something, it can lead to some really bad consequences morally, legally, just like from a utilitarian standpoint for everybody involved. So I think I'd draw the line somewhere. And I think if we don't set an example somewhere on that line, at least a cultural example of like, oh, I don't know if that's okay what you're doing. Like maybe I don't know. I can't say I'm the authority, and I don't think you have to be a moral authority to give a moral opinion. Like I think I can say, to me that feels like it could be wrong, and I have philosophical arguments about why I think that's the case. I think I can do that without saying I am the overlord of this spot and I'm going to like hand down the moral dictum to you and make you abide by it. But I do think that the behavior of many regs does go too far, and it is a bit like it does exemplify and embellish traits that I would like to see extinguished and quelled within society in a major way. And I think that's my problem with it mainly, as I've said. But yeah, you make some good points about while you're at the table, you may like follow this person about and lose 5 buy-ins. It's a game of variance. Anything could happen. But I guess what people are really trying to maximize is EV, not like money. It's like EV hunting more than it's money hunting. And that's a whole other conversation. Whether that changes the morality, my instinct is no, but it's a whole other question. Should we steer this conversation on to the next point that we have outlined?
Sure.
Okay, cool. We're also going to talk about, I think we have discussed a bit of liberty versus paternalism. That was your second point. We've covered that quite a bit there. Anything else to add on that?
I think one of the things that, a way that I think about poker too is that like, you know, what if every player there was like a small business owner, and it's like the business that you have is playing poker, you know, you're a player. I mean, this is how you would think about it if you're a professional. You're just a solo small business owner. What are you selling? Well, you're selling, for lack of a better term, action. You're selling the fact that you're a human being that's sitting down at the table that's engaging in a game of risk. Okay. Now, the degree of that risk and the degree of your skill is going to be different. But essentially, if you had a shop on a main street, your shop that's what you're selling. Okay. Now, a person who enters into that shop and wants to buy something from you, you're going to sell them what they want, because if you don't, you go out of business and you die, right? Now, the person who's coming into your store, what are they buying? Well, they're buying what you're selling. That to me is kind of where this conversation starts, and in a lot of ways where it ends. If you're selling, you know, let's say you're just selling widgets, and someone comes into your store and they've clearly been drinking and they're like, I want to buy like 15 widgets. You're going to be like, okay, yep, here you go. And they're going to march out with their widgets, you know. And I think that if you're also selling something that is like, you know, maybe the price of the widget on your block is $10 a widget, and you're selling widgets for $50, well, no one's going to come into your shop. Okay. So like if you're super nitty, people aren't going to want to play with you. But if you're selling widgets for $9 and everyone's selling for $10. Well, that dollar of difference is super important. That's your livelihood. That's like how you survive in business. That's your, that's your edge. And so I look at it like the same exact way. And there are situations where someone could walk into your shop and clearly be out of their mind, mentally ill, et cetera, et cetera. And then you would say, well, I don't think I can sell this to you. And I'm not even going to get into whether you're operating a bar or selling cigarettes or something. That's different. But let's just say it's a healthy product. You would draw the line somewhere. But I think also too, if you're advertising and you have someone come into your store, a marketing professional, and they say, here's how you target people who I think are going to be most likely to buy your goods. Well, you're going to do that. And all of that is fine. All of that is how you do business. So if you're a poker player and you're structuring your game and you're structuring your behavior in such a way so that you can maximize that $1 of edge over the market, how is that any different? And I think maybe it's different because there's more risk involved, et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of where I start with this. And it takes me a lot to deviate from that norm.
Okay. So maybe I can try and convince you to move slightly then, if not massively. The main thing I would say here is that when you operate with like a shop, people come to you, but you're not actively taking anyone off the street and bringing them into the shop. So right away, you're just kind of there passively. And I know that advertising is the way of like getting around that. That's where you're sort of seeking people out. So can we say that when people come to you in poker, they come into your shop, that's just like sitting at a table, or a weaker player arrives, or you sit down at an unknown table and there's a weak drunk player there that just happens to be there. Good luck you. The drunk guy came in and bought 11 widgets. Fine. So then if we say, well, when it comes to the parallel between bum hunting and being a business owner with a shop, that has to come from advertising and coercing or influencing others to come into your store, right, to buy something. So I own a store that sells shoes on the high street of a town in the UK, and I follow a person down the street and I say, hey, your shoes are really bad. Look at your shoes. Shoes are terrible. Do you know what can happen to you if your shoes are like that? You can actually get foot rot. Have you not heard foot rot? It's everywhere. It's the next thing. It's bigger than COVID, and the government's keeping it secret from you, and it will kill you if you don't get it. Like, I can show you. I've got some shoes right now that are really thick and they'll protect you from foot rot. And that person comes into my shop, scared the living daylight out of them, and they buy a pair of boots from me. That's just a normal pair of boots. I've not actually missold the boots. I just said they're thick and they'll keep the water off your feet. But I have kind of coerced them and manipulated them into my shop. And that feels like I've gone way out of my way to, again, be a predator. So again, I draw the line there with the business owner. That's clearly not okay. If I have a marketing campaign aimed at vulnerable people, like I'm selling gin, and I put it up in like, I like find the routes to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and put the posters all over the routes and stuff like that, that's clearly not okay. So there is a line whereby the business owner can actually do something really unethical with advertising and with like getting people into the store. And I think with the poker player, while most of the things the poker player does, like I'm going to sit at that table, I want to sit at this table, I would like to play on this site because it's full of weaker players, oh, that guy's drunk, so I'm going to stay a bit longer. I think most of these things are totally fine. I think when it starts being more predatory and we cross the threshold, I think I just sit where I did before on this, in that just as the poker player can cross that predatory line where society needs to do something, even if it's not illegal, so too does the business owner or someone in society needs to stop that from happening. And to me, it's not particularly relevant where the law sits on any of this. I just think there's a obligation at some point where the behavior goes too far. So I love the analogy. I think it's great. And I think you're right that most of the time the poker player has to do that. But I could see certain forms of bum hunting being the same as the business owner following someone down the street, using scare tactics, using coercion, using manipulation, and that kind of behavior. And I would say that that's not okay anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's good. I think, yeah, I draw the line at fraud. I think you can advertise whatever you want as long as you're not committing fraud. And fraud is generally lying to people about something, about getting in to enter into a contract based on a falsehood. And I think that I don't know, I think that the law is pretty good on that. All right. Well, I think we've beaten this bum into submission.
I think we've done a very bad
terrible
job.
Transition.
We've done a very bad job of like actually saying where the line is. I think intervention is probably necessary sooner than you do, but we both agree that like there is a point where the behavior is no longer good for society and crosses that point, and where that is exactly is super hard to say.
Right. And I think that one of your jobs as a poker player is to understand where that line is for you. And I think that one of the things that I find to be somewhat annoying is when you reach that line and you say, okay, enough's enough. I'm leaving this table. I'm getting away from this person. This feels creepy, predatory, whatever, even if you're sitting at the table with them and you haven't followed them into the bar, and someone comes up to you and says, oh, this game's really good. Like, this is how you have to keep playing. Like, what are you doing? Like, you're missing out. I think that's annoying. And I also feel like that's something I would never do to someone. I would never say that to someone, because I think everyone has their own line, and understanding where that line is like, there's EV and then there's what allows you to sleep at night. And at the end of the day, no matter how much money you have, whether you can live with yourself. All interesting questions that I think are up to individuals. But again, I think we both somewhat agree. We just differ on where the line is. But I think that's a hard line. And I think that arriving on a line and saying, my line is right here, 10 feet outside of the casino. If you follow someone beyond that, it's like, I think to me, that just sounds really bizarre and wrong. And I'm just not comfortable making any kind of drawing any kind of a line like that. But that's also why I'm not like a politician and someone that's elected to make laws.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not. I'm someone that kind of floats along and likes to talk about things. And I'm also pretty confident in my own moral code. And I feel like that also enables me to kind of maybe allow people more leeway than perhaps they should be.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, sometimes the way others behave, we get upset by it because it questions whether we should be allowing ourselves to behave in that way.
Yeah.
And we feel vulnerable about that. So I do take that point makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen people do things that I can say to myself, God, I would never do that. It's never like, oh God, I wish I could get away with that. I've never necessarily had that conversation. So anyways, I think that was interesting, and it's given me a lot to think about. And I think that we should move on to our next point here, which is, well, this is something you brought up. So do you want to kind of introduce it and
Sure.
set it up here?
Yeah, so it's become kind of apparent to me just throughout the years of being a professional in poker and doing what I do, that the poker player doesn't particularly offer that much back to society in the way that many other jobs do. So there are many professions that we could consider more altruistic professions that directly benefit society in a more, I don't know, obvious or apparent way. So for example, if you are a firefighter and you go and save cats from trees, that's great. You save people from burning houses, that's arguably even better, depending on how much you like cats and how much you like people. But this is definitely one of these professions that you could look at it and say, prima facie, that actually adds a lot of good to society, being a firefighter as opposed to not being a firefighter. Now, with poker, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here, and I don't actually hold the position that poker is a really immoral profession, or it's like a soulless profession that just like feasts upon dead money waiting to be taken from people or something like that, because I think there's a lot of good about being a poker player. There's a lot of virtuous things that I'm going to argue for later. But I wonder if I could just posit the question to you, is being this business owner, as you put it, being this poker player that just rocks up to the casino, makes money from people they're better at a game than, and studies how to beat people for more of their money, and then pays, their bills and makes their living profiting from other people in a game environment, almost a synthetic environment that people do recreationally. Where is the value to society in that? And do you think that professions overall, do you think it's integral to a profession that in order to be a worthwhile thing, it needs to add a value back into society? Or could there be professions that are just completely fine to do, even though they only take from the economy for yourself without providing anything of real worth or value in return? And if so, if those professions are bad, if they only do that, is poker one of those professions that actually doesn't give anything back and just takes?
I think that's a really interesting question, but I think my answer is yes. I think it's absolutely an ethical pursuit, and I absolutely think it brings value to society. And the reason it brings value to society is because if you can make a living doing something, then you are one less person who has to rely on other people to help you. So for instance, if you're someone who is making a small living at poker and spending all your time studying and going down to the casino and beating people that you're better with and that you have an edge on, yeah, you're not rescuing cats from trees. You're not, a doctor saving people's lives. You're not researching how to cure cancer. But so what? That's fine. You are living in a way that requires no one to have to pay for your existence. No other person has to pay for your existence. And I think that in itself is enormous. And I'm not saying that as a way to, this isn't like a screed against people who are unemployed or people who, for whatever reason, cannot function in a society to, support themselves. But I do think, just as a way of saying, what makes a society flourish? Well, what makes a society flourish is people, being able to make money on their own through entering into transactions, not having to rely on the government to help them. Also, I'll say that the value maybe comes from, if poker makes you happy, well, then maybe you're a better person outside of poker. Maybe it allows you to have healthier relationships. Maybe it allows you to be generally someone that is nicer to be around, and all of these other kind of intangible benefits that you get out of it in terms of the way you treat other people. I also think that more people should pursue things that they feel that they're good at. And so even if maybe you really enjoy poker but you're like terrible at it, okay, well, obviously you're not going to do it for a living, because you'll go broke and you'll starve. But if you're someone that enjoys it and also is able to make money from it, I mean, that is like, you're very, very lucky, because there's very few people in this world that can both make a living at something that they enjoy. And if you're like in that like rarefied zone, like that very like unusual place in life, that's wonderful. And that's something to be cherished and celebrated. And it should make you I feel like it should make you more generous as a person in general. And I also feel like we're very lucky to live in a time, like for the most part, like human history before, maybe like 60 or 70 years ago, was the saying is like life was nasty, brutish, and short, in the sense that like most people, like they woke up and they had to think about, okay, how do I get food? How do I protect myself from not getting killed? Not getting robbed, all of these things. Like, we have it so good at this point in history, like we're living better than ever. And I think like the fact that we can play a game for a living is phenomenal. So I hope that doesn't sound too wishy-washy or naive or anything. I do think that I understand your point. I do think there is a question of whether that's giving back to society, but I think that's where I come down on it.
Yep. So I have a few things to. I actually don't hold the belief that there's anything unethical about being a poker player as a profession. I think that you could also make an argument that there are a lot of jobs in the world where people don't really add very much back to society, but they're still jobs and they still exist. For example, if you are some bureaucrat in some company that really doesn't have much purpose, it's just part of some inefficient company shuffling papers back and forth and signing things that actually don't serve a purpose. What's the point of that bureaucrat? Like, are you really adding anything to society? Especially if your company is actually a company that is lobbying for the demolition of forests and the construction of like some kind of borderline unethical factory or something like that, and your job is to shuffle papers about in that industry. Not many people would look at that and say, you horrible person. They would say, well, fair enough, this person's making a living, they have a job. It's not so easy to find a job in something that's wonderful and altruistic and that you love. And to your point, yeah, a lot of people don't have a profession that they particularly like, and being able to do something you love for a living is in and of itself virtuous, I would say, to the self and outwardly as well, because you set an example that following the things you're good at. I'm a big believer that in any good functioning society, people do what they're good at. That's better for the collective. Like, if I'm a good poker player and you're a good baker, for example, just coming up with this randomly, I'm already picturing like the mob coming at me because you happen to be female and persecuting me for suggesting you might be good at baking here. But I actually had a friend, my friend Bobby was a baker, and he loved it, and he had these like leathery like baker hands after a while, and he loved, like, he could burn himself with everything, and it was great. So I was actually picturing him there when I said, if you're a good baker. But he worked in this really small town in Australia, and he became really good at baking. When he first started doing it, he had no idea what he was doing, and then he became like a manager of this bakery and ran this bakery, and it was great for that town, this isolated town, that he was a really good baker, because they were all able to eat all of that lovely baked goods that he was creating. Now, if he decided that he would actually be a counselor, I think he'd be a fairly bad counselor, just knowing my friend. I'm just imagining him in that role. Like, if he was a counselor and then some counselor was a baker, the whole thing would like fall apart. You know, it'd be awful for everybody involved. It would be like net negative. So I think like poker players playing poker and earning a living, doing something that they can do well, and stimulating the market, right? I'm a big believer in the free market like you are, and earning money that they invest into other things. They then consume things and spend that money. It drives the economy. I think this is really good. And I would say that it's not actually true that they give nothing back if they're able to do well and generate, business and revenue, and then spend that on things, and maybe even do good outside of their job. Why can't my job be like a paper pushing bureaucrat in some factory planning company, but then outside of work I actually help people and I'm really nice and I don't give people a hard time and I love my family and I make their lives better. Surely that's better than some fireman that comes home and beats his wife or something like that, just to make up an example. The fireman who comes home from rescuing cats and beats his family is much worse than the poker player that just goes to the casino and makes money from fish, in my opinion. So I'm actually not a believer in this point, but I thought it would be cool to play devil's advocate and kind of say, is poker shirking some kind of duty to society? I don't think so, as long as we live in a free market where the generation of revenue is beneficial to society overall, and then what you do outside of work. Yeah.
But I do think it's worth discussing and it's worth thinking about. And it can feel, I've certainly felt sometimes like, just being someone who's an amateur player is like, what am I doing like with my time? Like I'm coming to this room every day, or I'm, so because like so much of your life is dedicated to it, and there's a lot of other things you could be doing, and there's a lot of other ways that you could be spending your time and your resources. And to put it all in one basket is definitely something that is not, I mean, I think any intelligent person would have to have doubts at some point and think, gosh, like, am I just like, I see my friends doing all these other things with their money, saving, investing, et cetera, et cetera. And here I am just like, risking this all on a game or, pursuing one thing. That to me is really exciting. But the flip side of it is that it does feel sometimes like this is somewhat foolish and this may have been the wrong choice. And so I think that the ideal of like, or the idea that we're kind of both positing here is like the person who wakes up every day and like, is like, has like a nice home life and then like goes to the room and is friendly to everyone and sits down and like plays well. And then, maybe some days they lose, some days they, have a good session, and then they come home and they have enough money at the end of the month to pay bills and to send their kids to school and do all of these things that require, like, that is like a very idealized version of someone who's a poker player. I mean, the reality is I think that as someone who's a poker player, like probably struggles a lot with how they treat other people. I know I certainly do, especially in, if I've had a bad session, or especially if I'm playing against people who I find to be like annoying for whatever reason, or, playing terribly. I think I've mentioned before that I'm constantly holding my tongue, and sometimes I'm, more successful than others at the table. So I think that there are degrees of just playing poker alone is fine, but within that is a lot of other sub questions that I think go to like, well, how do you treat people that you play with? What is your day-to-day attitude? What is your, what effect is this having on your life? That could be very bad, very bad. And absolutely doing nothing for society and absolutely taking from society. So I think theoretically, there's nothing wrong with playing poker, but sometimes I think the more interesting question is like, how do you treat other people that you play with? And is that good for society? How do you treat the people that you care about outside of poker? Is that good for society? And sometimes these questions are difficult to answer, but I think they're all part of the same ultimate question, which is we make a choice to spend our lives doing certain things. And that choice, when you're young, maybe feels like, oh, I'll do this for a little while, then I'll try something else. But I think like as you get older, you realize like, okay, like the options are not as abundant at this point. And so like I've been doing this thing for so many years, I have to keep doing it. Or if I switch now, I'm going to have to start from the beginning. Those are difficult questions too. And I think I'm maybe rambling a little bit, but this is what you do. You get me thinking about these things, and I just keep going.
No, I think you're still kind of on topic here because...
Kind of on topic.
Well, how we choose to spend our life and how moral our endeavors are is a massively connected point, right? Like it would be really bad to get to the end of your life and then realize that you deemed what you spent your life doing to be a complete waste of time that had no value. And I'd maybe like to finish today by saying that I think that when we play poker, if we get really into it and we geek out, this phrasal verb geek out that people say these days, I really like it because it's like you get so embedded in something that you sort of you dig away at its layers and you unearth its true essence and you learn it and you master it and you really become, a master of a trade, just like a master chef would become a master of their trade.
Or a baker.
Or a baker, yeah. But master baker doesn't sound great when you put those two words together, so don't set me up with that one. So when we get a game or any profession or any field at all and we dedicate ourselves to mastery of that thing, I think there's actually like some kind of objective virtue or beauty to that, like some absolute core thing that exists, not like physically, but there's a metaphysical kind of value or worth there, what comes to mind is like this Platonic idea that there are these values instantiated in some other realm, like some heavenly realm that Plato talked about, and things in the real world can embody these like perfect ideals, right? The sort of like Platonic idea of virtues. And when I think about myself as a poker player, I take a real pride in it, and I take a real satisfaction in the fact that there is such a thing as the objective mastery of poker and being really, really good at it and getting lost within it and immersed in it. And if I can do that to a really good extent, even if I don't save cats from trees, you know, as long as I don't beat my loved ones, I can probably say that that's something with real objective worth. Not everything that has objective worth, in my opinion, has to add worth to humans. There can just be things that exist conceptually that are worth a lot. And I think the mastery of a game is a beautiful thing in the same way that a painting is a beautiful thing, and each of those things adds a lot of worth, you know, to the beholder and the producer of those things. So the artist, there's a ton of work that goes into that. There's a ton of moral excellence in creating an amazing painting, and there's a ton of benefit to the person that observes or buys or beholds that painting. Now with poker, me learning to be as good at the game as I can, I really see this personally as like some kind of moral pursuit. Like the artist creating the painting is like me becoming as good as I can at poker. And then the student or the person that I talk to poker about that consumes my content or buys a course or something like that and then digests that, that's like them getting the painting that I've spent all that work creating. So I think this whole, like, why I want to give something back in poker, why I want to like be a creator and a teacher, is that I love that and I wouldn't want to be isolated, but it's also because I think there's a real objective value within that. So I think it is important, to your point, to get to the end of your career and then say, is that something that had an objective worth, or is that pushing, you know, through those papers in that bureaucratic factory installation committee, which sounds like hell. That sounds like a sort of Petersonian idea of hell on earth, like having that job. So I think the poker player has a lot more of a rich existence compared with that, for example.
Well, I think anytime when you pursue something that has an objective truth and you master it, you're communicating that truth to other people. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're doing anything, for the most part, I mean, if you're communicating truth, there's so much value in that, because so much of our society is about not communicating truth. It's about communicating noise and chaos and crap and ugliness and cruelty. The people who are communicating truth are few and far between. And so you can communicate truth. Really, you don't have to be like, you know, a master at something. You can communicate truth in the way that you live your life. You can be a bureaucrat pushing papers and communicate truth, because when someone comes to you and says, I need you to lie on this document so that it's going to make it easier for us to cut down this forest, you say, no, I don't lie. Things like that. Like communicating truth is really the struggle that all of us have to kind of shoulder and every day. But I think that the way you articulated, you know, being able to achieve like an objective skill, like a trade, I do think of poker as a trade and learning a trade, because there's an objective truth to it and you can be objectively good and play it objectively correctly. That is truth. And being able to, even with not necessarily, I'm not a poker coach or a teacher, but just by playing, I think in a way that is objectively true. You're communicating truth, and that is good. And that is, the world needs more of that. So I think that, yeah, I'm really glad you put it in that way, because I 100% agree. And I think it's good. I think it's good to be true.
I totally agree. I think these days there is just so much convoluted, manipulative stuff out there where people are trying to achieve their own agenda. They're treating other people and other things as means to their ends instead of ends within themselves. Like Roald Dahl, for example, wrote some books that everybody loved and children thought they were great and adults loved reading them to their children, and these books have been taken and alternate versions of them have now been created. Initially the plan was to actually replace the books entirely with alternate versions that don't say words like fat and are less likely to cause offense, and in doing so changing, altering and vandalizing the work. And that's just one example of the way society is going right now, in my opinion, where the emphasis is so much on this new wave of emotivism and how people are feeling and what they're entitled based on their feelings. Apparently, if you feel a certain way, you are therefore entitled to whatever the sum of all of the things that would make you feel better are, and that to me is absurd. So this, going back to truth for a second here, poker is concrete, it's absolute. It doesn't bend to your emotive whims. It has nothing to do with anything other than this objective reality. And to me, one of the only things we can really do in this lifetime to make things better for ourselves is take our wonderful organs, the brain, which is like an amazing thing, apply it to an objective thing that exists with its own fascinating properties, and then improve either the brain or the thing or both or other people's brains and their experiences through that interaction. And if interacting with poker can do that for me and it can do it for other people, then to me it's a really noble thing. And I think that's why I steer so far, away from the degenerate, like, here's people playing bomb pots and getting it in for 10 million. I don't care. Like, you could like have the richest person in the world. You could have like Elon Musk and Bill Gates playing a hand for like 50 million, and it could be a bomb pot all in pre, and I wouldn't even watch it. I wouldn't give a shit who won that 50 million pound bomb pot. Wouldn't care. But like, give me like a 10-NL spot with one reg against the fish at 10-NL, and what's the highest EV play on the turn with 6-5 suited with the gutter out of position. I'm all over it. It's fascinating. I can't wait to talk about it. And the difference is that there's substance to the latter. And I think that's why I try to pitch content in a way that shows people that there's a hell of a lot more to poker than what you may be being led to believe on the surface. And I hope anyone listening to this that isn't that deep into poker yet will, I don't know, maybe be inspired to engage with the game and all of its complex beauty, because there's a hell of a lot of it. It's a really, truly magnificent and vast beast to study. And I think that's where a lot of the value comes in, is that sort of excellence of applying the human brain to do such a thing. So yeah, I did raise that question more to play devil's advocate, and I do think this conversation, however, has really helped, at least for me, to realize that I am actually really happy about what I do, and it's kind of helped me reach that epiphany. So that was an unexpected bonus for sure.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. All right. Well, I guess we'll maybe leave it there. It's a good place to end. Pete's happy, which is unusual, so we'll take it while
it'll last another 4 minutes or something like that until something annoys me. I'm about to go read some Discord messages from people, so after I've done that, I'll be back to the norm of being furious again, so don't worry.
I'll just add real quick that news about the Roald Dahl, rewriting it, whatever, like that, I find that physically painful.
Yeah.
I feel like people massacring art, destroying something because you're unable to create, is an act of evil in my mind. And I find it very, very difficult to read about. And it makes me really sad that it's happening. But I also think that it's something that we should have no qualms about, the length that some people will go to destroy things that are good in order to build up things that give them power and authority.
Yep.
That's my takeaway.
Couldn't agree more, and I'm glad that you said that. And I think what we will do on the show sometimes is we'll have the odd conversation about things that aren't poker related at all, just once a month, something like that. And I would love to get into more of this. I think it's extremely important, more than ever right now, that we speak up against this absolute tidal wave of wokest nonsense and delirium that's sweeping over the world and is causing, not just the destruction of art, but also just like extreme, I don't even want to get into it because there's so many problems with the way our culture is going. And there have always been problems on both sides, especially like with you guys in America, you've always had a very polarized kind of political situation. But what's always been true historically is that it's sort of self-maintained and counterbalanced itself. Like the right and the left have never gone so far, at least in times that I can remember, that one hasn't been able to like pull the population back again. I'm sure it will happen here too, but I think this has gone alarmingly far, alarmingly quickly. And now it's time for there to be a bit of a resistance or revolution or some kind of cultural shift, and I'm sure that will happen, but I'd love to talk to you at some point about how we might do that and why it's necessary. Sure. And get into that at some stage.
Everyone has a role to play. I mean, I think even if it's just as simple as just not lying, not agreeing to be insincere, just telling the truth, not going along with, and obviously it's a very difficult question, and there's a lot of, especially when it comes into what you have to do to protect your job and things like that, like it's very difficult. But I think in general, like, just trying to tell the truth is like the first step, and that goes a long way. And you'd be amazed at how many opportunities you have every day to lie, and just refusing to do that I think it has a lot of value for yourself, and it's quite eye-opening.
Definitely, yeah.
Big topic.
It's a big topic, yeah, but we'll get into some of this, guys. Yeah. So if you're listening to this thinking, why on earth have they just started a foray into something else? We will leave it there, but we will address, if you have any ideas for non-poker topics you'd like us to discuss, it doesn't have to be political. It doesn't have to be about, where is our culture damaging art. That's just, that's one suggestion of a topic that came to mind. It can be anything. So why don't you guys let us know if you're part of our Discord group? Let us know there. Let us know in the YouTube comments. Just give us some ideas for non-poker related content, and I'm sure we'd be happy to hash out a discussion. All right, Melissa, this has been really fun.
And I'm going to just add real quick that we've gotten some really great feedback so far and some great reviews from people. And I just wanted to say on behalf of both of us, thank you very much. If you're one of those people who have left us nice reviews and you're enjoying the podcast, that really makes us feel good, and it's really helpful, and we certainly appreciate it. So thank you.
Absolutely. 100% echo that. All right, guys, we will see you back here for episode 5. Have a great week, and we'll see you in the next episode of Poker Distilled. Bye for now.